Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 3, Demand and Supply and Elaboration. So this segment, the first segment, is on simultaneous changes in supply and demand. So last chapter, in Chapter 2, we learned all about what causes demand and supply to shift. Those are the changes. So the whole curve moving one way or the other. Remember, big difference in change in demand and supply versus change in quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So we're looking at this chapter, which now is going to have us shift supply and demand both at the same time. So really we've learned all this, only we haven't done them at the same time. So that's what we're going to do here. But first, let's do a really quick review of the determinants of supply and demand. And we did this last chapter. This is one of those slides that you might want to print off and keep handy because it'll help you when you're doing all the exercises and stuff. So first of all, the things that shift demand, and that means moving the whole curve to the right or left, are consumer preferences, if there's a change, either a positive or negative, consumer incomes, if there's a change in consumer incomes, which way would it shift demand? Price of related products, that's substitutes and complements. If those prices change, then the demand for the product in question will shift. And then we did expectations of futures prices, expectations of income or availability will change demand today. And population, size, income distribution, and age distribution, we talked extensively about how those will shift demand as well. So this is what we're talking about. There's our demand curve, and we're talking about moving the whole curve to the right or the whole curve to the left. So those are shifts in demand. Just like determinants of supply, here's my supply curve, and now we're talking about supply curve increase to the right or decrease to the left. So the price of productive resources is the most common one. That's the price of inputs. If the cost of producing goes down, then supply shifts to the right. Business taxes, that's a cost. If those go down, supply would shift to the right. Technology, as that improves, supply shifts to the right. And then we hit the last three, prices of substitutes in production. So a producer can look at producing two types of things, maybe two types of electronics. And if there's a huge increase in price of one particular type that the producer could sell it for, well, they're going to like that. So they're going to increase production of that, but decrease the supply of the first good. Future expectations of suppliers will change their supply, and the number of suppliers, that's an easy one, as more enter the market, then the supply curve shifts to the right. So those are determinants. It's just a wordy review of the shifters. Make sure you understand those and you can do them when you're looking at a problem. Understand which one is causing demand or supply to shift. So we're going to look at shifting both curves now. So the first example we're going to do on simultaneous changes is we're going to increase demand and increase supply by the same amount. That's the critical part here. So this is a market for labor, so I'll say for workers, or a market for labor down here, and they're programmers. And the price of labor is just the wage. So this is the wage rate. So don't let that confuse you. Here's our initial equilibrium where we've got demand one and supply one, and we've got our wage one. So that's our starting point where we've got our wages, and there's a certain quantity of labor in equilibrium. So demand equals supply. Now we're going to have a simultaneous shift. So both demand and supply are going to increase, and that will always lead to an increase in quantity. Why? Because demand goes up and supply goes up, so there'll be an increase in quantity. So we shift our two curves. There's our increase in demand. The red curve, there's our increase in supply. The blue curve, so there we are at S2 and D2. I'll circle them just to highlight them. And we find our new equilibrium point right there, just where the two new curves cross. But they both shifted the same amount. So wages, when we come back, they didn't change because both curves shifted the same amount. But quantity definitely went up because both curves increased. Both curves shifted to the right. So the conclusion here, if they increase the same amount, price will remain unchanged, but definitely an increase in quantity. And these little things you're going to have to kind of keep in mind as you're doing these, because everyone will get different answers. Okay, let's go on and we'll look at where they shift by different amounts. So we can do this a little quicker. We're going to increase both in demand and supply. So definitely equilibrium quantity increases, right? But let's pause for a second. We're going to start at our initial equilibrium, find our initial price, our initial quantity. Okay, then we're going to increase demand to D2 and increase supply to S2. Find the new equilibrium point. Well, here we notice that demand increased more than supply did. So our intersection is just a little higher than our old one. It's definitely further to the right because quantity increased, but in this case, it's a little higher than our old one because demand increased more than supply. I hope you can see that. We find that our wage increased as well as our quantity. So in this case, when demand increases more than supply, we actually get, of course, an increase in quantity. But in this case, wages went up. In the previous slide, wages stayed the same. Now let's go on and increase supply more than demand. Okay, so we're going to increase supply more than demand. So that's easy. Let's do this a little quicker yet. Here's where demand one and supply one cross. There's our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price or wage rate at first. And then we're going to increase demand a certain amount to D2. But in this case, we're increasing supply by more than we increase demand to S2. So increase in both demand and supply, of course, leads to an increase in equilibrium quantity. And I emphasize that, of course, because we're going to have a table that summarizes what we know for sure. We know for sure quantity increased here. But if supply increases more than demand, then equilibrium price falls. So let's look at that. Here's our new equilibrium. Here's our new equilibrium quantity, and for sure it went up, as always. But here we notice we find our new equilibrium wage has fallen. So our conclusion here, if supply increases more than demand, equilibrium price, or in this case wage, falls. So we've got an interesting situation. Let me just clear this. When both increase the same amount, I'm going to click back 2 slides. When both increased the same amount, quantity went up for sure, but wage stayed the same. Next slide. When demand increased more than supply, quantity went up, of course, but this case price went up. And then the third case, when demand increased less than supply increased, quantity went up, of course, but price fell off in this case. So that's really, in a nutshell, all we need to know about simultaneous changes in demand and supply. But you have to also adapt it to if both demand and supply decrease, or if demand increases and supply decreases, or if demand decreases and supply increases. So in the next segment, I'll do those extra 3 just on the whiteboard so we get a good solid feel for this.